Hello, everyone. I'm Jenn Goldson. I'm a planning consultant. I'm here with Anna Callahan.
Hi.
Anna and I are from my company, JM Goldson, and we've been hired by the town of Ipswich to help prepare a housing production plan. And we're going to tell you all about what that means and all the nuances of it. But I just want to say first that I'm really happy to be making this recording for you, and I hope you find it helpful. So you might wonder, why are we doing a housing plan right now in the middle of a pandemic? And the truth is, we didn't know there was going to be a pandemic before we started this project. But if you think about it, the plan's actually quite timely, given the economic insecurity issues that we're facing, leading to housing stability issues. And you can see these types of headlines all over the news right now. So I think in some ways, the silver lining of doing the plan now is that you get to be really thoughtful about housing in Ipswich at a time when we can see how much housing is actually needed. So you'll see this HPP throughout the document. We just shortened Housing Production Plan. And what a housing production plan does is well, first of all, let me just say it's not a requirement. It's an incentive-based plan. Communities choose to do it because they want more control ultimately over 40B comprehensive permits, but they really want more control over development in their community. And what a housing production plan does for the communities who opt to do one is it really puts you in the driver's seat to help shape what kind of development do you want to see in your community, and how can you shape that development through regulations, through policies, through funding choices. And so it's really about shaping your own future. No community, no matter if you're a big city or a community like Ipswich, wants to be told or forced to do something. And that's how many people feel 40B acts in reality. I know that that's not what necessarily was intended, but it feels like it's a hammer. And so communities really want to gain more control. And what this local control really does is helps you figure out how you can make progress on your own terms. And so that's really what the housing production plan is all about. It's about figuring out what can we do as a community to make progress toward housing needs, but on our own terms. So the question at the heart of this effort as a planner, as a community planner, is really asking this question and finding some answers to it that feels right for your community. And the question is, how should you protect your coastal character and your historic assets while still creating more housing options in the community? And what that's really about is, well, what's the right balance? It's not all or nothing. And what a good plan will do for a community is to find a balance that's really customized for that community. So let's get back to this thought about putting you in the driver's seat when it comes to development and housing development in particular. I like to think about that saying about teaching a person how to fish rather than doing it for them. And I really think it's what a housing production plan can do for you is it helps you figure out, how can we feed ourselves in a way? How can we create the housing that we know we need in the places we want to see that housing and the type of housing that we want? And what it does is it provides a roadmap and a series of tools that you can use in your community to really shape that development yourselves. So 40B, we know, is effective. It's the most effective tool in the Commonwealth that is creating the housing that we need, affordable and multifamily housing. But it's very unpopular because of the reasons I talked about before, because it feels like it's a hammer on the community. So rather than having 40Bs that you don't desire, the HPP helps you create a path to meet your housing needs, again, on your own terms. So I want to define a few key things about housing in Massachusetts so that when we're talking about the housing production plan and moving forward with, well, how do you want to shape your housing in your community and development in your community? I want us to be able to use some terms that we all have a similar understanding of. And I also want us to understand what are the forces shaping housing and how do we look at those indicators when we're thinking about what our housing needs in the community. So when we talk about Chapter 40B, what we're really talking about is a state statute. It's called the Comprehensive Permit Law. It was established in 1969, and it was really in response to the National Civil Rights Movement. It was Massachusetts' way, one of the ways. It was trying to set a goal. It's a very lofty goal of having social equity in the Commonwealth. And what it says is that every community should have its fair share of affordable housing. And what the statute defines as fair share is 10% of the community's year-round housing stock or housing units. So not including seasonal units, just year-round units. 10% of that number of units in every community should be designated as housing that is, well, it's a little complicated because it's housing that is affordable, but there are some nuances about what counts as affordable housing on something called the subsidized housing inventory. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but the most basic way to describe this is 10% of every community's year-round housing stock should be counted as affordable. And the thing that 40B, I think, does get right is that it recognizes every community in the Commonwealth has a role to play, really. And it's like we see all these, we're in this together. I pulled from something completely unrelated to housing, but we see this all over the place now in response to the COVID crisis, trying to get people to wear their masks. Well, it's the same thing in a way. It's looking at how can we look at the state's needs all together, knowing that every community has its part to play. And how can we promote social equity and address the housing shortage so that that burden doesn't fall on just a few select communities, mostly cities. So then the question is, if 40B says that there's a state goal that every community has 10% of its housing stock as affordable, what happens if a community doesn't have 10% of its housing stock as affordable? So what happens is developers can then seek a comprehensive permit, which has been in the news. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that term. But if you're not, it essentially it does two things. It allows developers who are proposing to create affordable or mixed income housing. It allows them to request waivers from the Zoning Board of Appeals to override local regulations, including zoning regulations. And then if that decision, let's say a community wants to deny a permit, you have the right to do that. But let's say it does deny a permit, or let's say the ZBA, the Zoning Board of Appeals, puts conditions on a permit. What can happen is that it can then be appealed to a group called the Housing Appeals Committee. And those appeals often overturn the town's decisions. So they often overturn the town's denials, and they often overturn conditions. Conditions are overturned if the project is deemed, or if the conditions make the project uneconomic. So those are the two reasons that the Housing Appeal Committee really overturns those decisions, and that happens often. So a community needs to be very careful about how it goes through these reviews, and there is very limited amount of control if you are below the 10%. Except if you have a housing production plan. And we'll talk more about the kind of control that a housing production plan can give you when you're below that 10% requirement, as Ipswich is. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of how a HPP helps you have more local control when you're below the 10% requirement, I want to make sure we all understand what we're talking about when we use the term subsidized housing inventory, or SHI. So when I said before that you had to have 10% of your housing stock as affordable, that wasn't completely true. And the reason is because of the nuances of the way the units are counted. So there is a list called the Subsidized Housing Inventory, and all it is a list of all the units that count toward a community's 10% goal. In order to count, though, you need to meet 4 things. So sometimes communities think, well, we have a lot of naturally affordable units, units that are just less expensive than others. Why shouldn't they count? And so the answer is because there are 4 specific things that a unit needs to have in order to be eligible for the subsidized housing inventory. One is that it needs to be either subsidized by a state or federal program, or it has to be created through some kind of local initiative, like using Community Preservation Act funds, for example, to create a unit. 2, it needs to be affordable to households with low or moderate income, and that's defined as at or below 80% of the area median income. And I have a slide that's going to tell you exactly what those thresholds are. 3, it needs to be affirmatively and fairly marketed. So it can't just be listed on the open market in the normal way that other units are listed. It needs to be much more broadly marketed to the region, and you need to select who is able to live in those units in a different way than you would in a normal market rate unit. And then 4, it needs to actually have a long-term affordability restriction that says this unit will stay affordable. Even if the market changes, it will stay affordable for a long time. And what long time means in the terms of 40B is at least 30 years. That's generally, there are some exceptions, but that's generally the requirement. So why do I say that this means some of the units may not be affordable? It seems like from these 4 eligible points that they would be affordable, and that's true. But what 40B says for a comprehensive permit is that you need either 20% or 25% of the total units in the development to meet this criteria. And that means that the other 75% or 80%, depending on the type of project it is, don't need to be restricted in any way. They can be market rate units. And if the project is all rental units, all rental, not condos, then you can actually count all of those rental units on the subsidized housing inventory, even though 75 or 80% of the units in a development are market rate. So hopefully that makes sense. I usually pause and take some questions at this point. Once we get into the nitty-gritty, there's often a lot of questions, but I can't do that because we're recording this from home and you'll watch it later. Okay, so now in Ipswich, the subsidized housing inventory, you're very close. You're at about 8.95%. And that means that you have 513 units that do count on the subsidized housing inventory, and you need 61 more to reach that 10% goal. This is the threshold, the income thresholds. They're set by the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department. I don't know, what is HUD, Anna? And I guess it's an agency. And they change every year. And so they also differ by household size. These are the newest income thresholds that I pulled for you for this presentation. But again, next year they'll change. And so just to give you an idea of those limits, if you're a person living alone in a house and you make $67,400 or less, you could be counted as eligible for affordable housing under 40B. That would be 80% of the area median income. If you are a person living with 3 other people, so you're a household of 4, and you make $96,250, then you could also count as eligible for affordable housing. Now these programs to see if you're eligible also look at your assets. So that's not the only thing that they look at. But these are the income thresholds by household size. And again, as the household number goes up, the threshold changes. Now, if you are in a household of 4, for example, sometimes people ask me, well, does that count for adult roommates? And does it count 2 adults with 2 kids? And does it count 1 adult with 3 kids? And the answer is yes. It's just 4 people living in a household. It doesn't matter how many of those people are working age and working and earning. It's the combined income of all the people living in that household is what is counted. So the next question you might have for me is, well, how many households in Ipswich actually meet this criteria potentially? Now, this is just an estimate, but it's about 42% of the households in Ipswich are estimated to be low or moderate income and could potentially qualify for affordable housing under 40B. So that's almost 2,400 households. So now I want to talk about the type of housing that's needed the most. And it's really pretty straightforward. You need more housing options, particularly affordable, mixed income, and multifamily housing. And I'm going to have a few slides that explain 3 reasons why I'm saying that providing these types of housing options is important to the region, important to the state, and important to Ipswich. So 1, home prices are generally too high for people because the housing supply is systematically constrained. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So when I say home prices are too high for people, what do I mean? So let's look at both for sale properties and rental properties. So for sale properties, if you look across the state, people who earn the median income, which is basically the middle. I have a little definition of what median means. It's not the same as average. But if you look at the median household income across the whole state, and you do some calculations around, well, what could a household at that income afford if you assume they're not paying more than 30% of their income toward housing costs, you see that in order for that household to buy a median priced home, which is also the middle of housing out there, the prices that housing is currently, there's a gap of just under $100,000, about $95,000. So someone making the median income actually can't afford the median priced home. And that's an indicator to us that something's out of whack. Same thing happens when you look at Ipswich, but it's even more dramatic. You get a difference or a gap, we like to call it, of 171,000. And this is the median household who lives in Ipswich. That's what that 80,829 figure is. It's an estimate, but that's the most recent estimate that we have. So now let's look at rental properties. When we say housing prices are too high for people and we look at rental, what kind of indicators do we look at? So first of all, statewide, it's well recognized that there is a big rental housing shortage. Particularly, there's a need for rental housing for households with extremely low income. So if you look at Ipswich in particular, the median contract rent, now this is an estimate from the census, so the rental prices are probably higher than this, but this is the best number that we have right now. If you just look at that number, which is probably low, the median estimated contract rent was about $1,900. In order to afford that and not pay more than 30% of your income for this rent, you would need to make about $77,000 for the household, $77,600. But in Ipswich, the median renter, existing households in Ipswich who are renting already, the median income for a renter household in Ipswich is only $38,000, a little over $38,000. So you can see that there's a big gap. And what that means is they're probably in units that are not affordable to them because they're paying more than 30%, probably well above 30% of their income. When I talk about systematically constrained housing supply, what does that mean? You say, isn't it a free market? People can build housing. Well, no, it's not really, because you have all these communities, including Ipswich, has zoning. And when you look at, there's a great report, if you haven't read it yet, you should. It's by Amy Dane. It's called The State of Zoning for Multifamily Housing in Greater Boston. And she has 4 general conclusions when she looks at multifamily housing in Greater Boston and why aren't we able to produce enough to meet the needs of the region. There's really 4 reasons I wanted to highlight. One, there's very little land in the region that's really zoned for multifamily. Even sometimes when it looks like it's zoned for multifamily, there are no parcels in that district that are feasible to actually use the zoning to create the multifamily. So there's very little real land that's zoned for multifamily. The second is that in our state and the broader region, a lot of the multifamily is permitted through discretionary decision-making, through special permits mostly. And so what that means is that it's done project by project and it's discretionary. And there really isn't there aren't a lot of communities out there that allow by right multifamily housing. And so that means that getting approval is uncertain and it often takes a long time. The third point is that multifamily housing sometimes is only permitted if it's mixed use, meaning commercial and housing. And often you see that in commercial areas, which makes sense. You think, yeah, well, top of shop, that makes a lot of sense. Why don't we want to encourage mixed use housing in our commercial areas? It's more traditional. The traditional way our downtowns were created. But the truth is that the market for commercial isn't always there. And so what happens is that nothing's built, because if you're forcing the developer to have commercial in the project, then they actually can't make the numbers work to do anything. The fourth reason that we're seeing a systematically constrained housing supply is that a lot of the multifamily in the region that is approved isn't in downtown or centers. It really is favoring the periphery of communities. And so, what that really means is that there are very few areas in communities. If you're trying to push all multifamily out to the edges of your town, there may be environmental constraints. There may be other things that are happening in those areas. Maybe there's conservation areas. Maybe there are just disconnection from transportation centers and from public transportation. There are lots of reasons why trying to create multifamily on the peripheries of communities inhibits its production. But it also, I would argue, hurts the community as a whole. And so we see that the options to create multifamily in downtowns and town centers are more restricted in general throughout the region. Okay, so number 2 reason that multifamily, affordable and mixed use housing is constrained, or is needed, I should say, is that people's incomes really haven't matched. They haven't grown as much as the housing prices. And so when people say, back when I was buying a house or whatever, I just had to work hard and I could afford it. And that actually makes a lot of sense when you look at the numbers, because now what we're seeing is that income's only gone up in this time frame. I looked at the statewide figures for you, so you have it in context. In the past almost 20 years, we had numbers up to 2018 estimates. Income's only risen about 19%, whereas gross rent went up almost 80% and sales prices went up over 102%. So you can see why I'm saying that people's incomes haven't grown much compared to the housing prices. So the system's really broken. Incomes aren't keeping pace with the increase in housing prices. So it's harder and harder to afford housing. So this is all about supply and demand. Systems off balance. And so there are so many people in the state and in the region and in Ipswich who are spending too much on housing, who need safe, decent, affordable housing, but there's just not enough supply. And so what does this do? It does a lot of things, but one thing it does is it really pushes the workforce out of communities where they can't find housing that's financially attainable. And that hurts economic competitiveness overall. And there's lots and lots of studies and reports showing this. But this is one that you can look up, the growing shortage of affordable housing for extremely low income in Massachusetts. And the lack of financially sustainable housing options. So notice I didn't say affordable housing in this particular slide because I'm not necessarily talking about affordable deed restricted housing. It's just that housing is too expensive overall. And because there aren't enough options that are attainable for the people who need housing, what happens is you end up in housing units that are just too expensive compared to your income. So you spread your income too thin, it erodes your disposable income, meaning you probably can't spend as much money at local shops and to support the local economy. And it also increases your chance of losing your home. And this has really been an issue it's been there for a long time, but it's been really, I would say, illuminated and exacerbated by the pandemic. So in the county as a whole, about half of the renters who live in the county spend too much on their housing. They spend more than the 30% on housing costs. And then in Ipswich in particular, many of the households who are spending too much for housing in your community are older adults. Okay, the third reason that providing more affordable mixed income and multifamily housing is important is that if you look at single family sprawling development patterns that we see all over the region, all over the country, really, it's not unique to this community, but what it really does is it destroys scenic beauty, your natural assets, it exacerbates automobile dependency, and it really doesn't provide housing options that meet the needs of a changing population. So when your zoning is so geared toward creating single-family homes, what you find is that it's really hard to balance that against conservation and other things that you may care about. So when you care both about conservation of natural resources and open space and scenic beauty, and you also care about having a vibrant downtown, a vibrant commercial center that's walkable and has, shops and activity and life, what you really want to do is try to strategically locate multifamily and mixed-use development in a way that can really meet your housing needs, provide housing options that we know, I hope by now from the slides I showed you before, are really important and needed in the community and in the region and the state in a way that strikes a really nice balance for your community. So a lot of people are probably familiar with the term smart growth. I know some people are getting sick of that term, but it actually does make a lot of sense. And this is exactly what I'm talking about in this slide. So your current housing doesn't fully meet the needs of a changing population. Your population is getting older and prefers housing options in general in walkable mixed-use places that have good transit connection. So I thought this was pretty interesting to show you. This is showing you the population by age category in your town, in Ipswich, and it's showing you how it's really changed. So when I say the population's getting older, what does that really mean? If you look at this chart on the bottom from 1990, you can see that the peak, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see my cursor, but I'm going to use it anyway. You can see that there's a peak right here on this chart, and that corresponds to people ages 25 through about 50. That was in 1990. But now when you look at the most recent data we have from 2018, you'll see these blue bars. There's it's a big dip in the graph for that age range. You don't have as many people proportionally that are in that age range. What you have is a lot more people who are older in the community. And the other interesting thing about Ipswich, if this little black, the black outline is the proportion of the population that are these ages in the state. And then the blue is in Ipswich. And so you can see Ipswich has a lot more older people, proportionally speaking, than the state does. Okay, so let's talk about zoning. We've looked at your zoning and we ran an analysis that tried to figure out how many of the properties in zoning districts actually meet the requirements of your zoning. So if you're familiar with zoning in general, you will typically have a minimum lot size requirement for a type of land use. And if you look at those lot size requirements in many, many, many communities, the lot size minimums are actually bigger than what's even on the ground. And so some people say, well, that creates illegal neighborhoods. Well, yeah, you could say it that way. Really what it does is it creates a lot of non-conforming lots. But I'm not so interested about the legality of that. What I'm interested in is, how does your zoning reflect what's actually on the ground? In your community, you actually have more density in your existing traditional neighborhoods. And I say traditional because historically neighborhoods were built relatively dense because people didn't rely on cars. They walked places for the most part. And what we find is that in older communities, the zoning often doesn't even reflect the historic character of the development pattern that's actually on the ground. So we looked at that in Ipswich. And so I'm zooming in here to the central business district, really linking this to the idea of smart growth. So 33% of the residential properties in your central business district are on smaller lots than your zoning currently allows. Multifamily is not allowed by right in any district. It's only allowed by special permit. And so the question is, are the minimum lot sizes for multifamily reasonable? And are there actually development opportunities? If you do an analysis for, well, if you wanted to build, let's say, 20 units somewhere, could you actually find a lot that meets the minimum requirements in the zoning districts that allow multifamily? The other thing I want to point out, and we don't know the answer to that, by the way, but that's an important question to ask. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that the average housing unit per acre around about half a mile from your train station, which is roughly walkable at about about 10 minutes for kind of an average walking speed to get to the train station. So we like to look at a half mile from a point of public transportation. So when you look at the density around your train station, and this is, if you want to check this, there's a pretty cool website from MHP called TODEX, TODEX, I think it is, Anna. If you Google that, I think you'll find it. But the whole analysis is on there. The average housing unit within that 10-minute walk of your train station is less than the average density really is less than 4 units per acre. And that's really just too low to sustain a healthy transit system. So people complain all the time. I'm not just talking about Ipswich, everywhere. They complain, well, the train's not convenient, it doesn't come enough, all these reasons that they're unhappy with transit. But there's a flip side of this issue, and that is there enough residential housing density to actually support a healthy transit system? Are there enough people nearby who can take that public transit? And so if you look at this TODEX site, you'll see that they say roughly you need about 10 units per acre to support a healthy transit system, and you're not even halfway there. So something to ponder. Okay, Anna, I get to take a break, and now it's your turn.
Okay, so I'm just going to go over sort of like a crash course in a housing production plan. What are the things that you need to have in it, and what is really sort of the purpose after you get the HPP? What happens next, and what sort of control does it give to you? Okay, next slide. Oh, next slide. Yeah, sorry, I don't have control. Okay, so a housing production plan has to have four things. It has to have a needs assessment, and that basically looks at, is the current housing stock meeting the needs of the current population and also the projected population. So Jen was talking about how there's a significant proportion of the population is in older adults, and also that that proportion is projected to increase over the next 10 years. And so part of the needs assessment analysis that we did looked at what is the current housing stock and what are the projected needs and how will that change. The other piece that goes into that is around where can you actually produce and create new housing units. And that part of that is the development constraints analysis. And that basically looks at environmental constraints, regulatory constraints. So like Jen was talking about the zoning limitations and what the zoning says you can and cannot do. And then also infrastructural constraints. So, and it's one of the things that we looked at as part of that analysis was, wetlands makes up a large proportion of land area in Ipswich. I think about a third of the land is wetlands, which limits development. And also there's a regulatory component to wetlands that they're protected by a wetlands protected bylaw, and almost over half of land is affected by that bylaw, and that will limit development on where you can and cannot build. And so that's one thing. And then in a couple slides, I'll show sort of some other things that came out of that analysis. The third thing that goes into a housing production plan that you need to have are goals and strategies to achieve that 10% threshold that's set by the state, and then also a 5-year action plan to achieve that 10%. But in addition, so the primary goal of a housing production plan is, a tool to try and a sort of a roadmap for a community to reach that 10% threshold. But it can also include other tools that can affect the housing needs and address the housing needs in a community. So some of those things you can include goals and strategies around creating middle income units, which won't count towards your the number of units on the SHI, but might be a critical component that you need in the community. You can also include programs for direct assistance to households. So an example of that could be creating an emergency rental assistance program, something that we've seen come up a lot in a lot of communities right now with COVID, or a first-time down payment assistance program for home buyers. And so those are some examples. It can also include strategies around creating other diverse housing options. So that could include accessory dwelling units or cluster housing. So it's things that might also not directly affect an SHI threshold. And that's really the primary purpose of a housing production plan. But you can also incorporate these other tools that will still help address some of the housing needs in the community. Okay, next slide. So this is sort of just a slide showing some of the development constraints and opportunities that we saw as part of the analysis. And in the materials that we're distributing, there will also be some other maps and other findings that we found from both the needs assessment and the development constraints. And I'm not going to go into them so much here, but some of the things that we found from our analysis on the development constraints, and one of the things I mentioned was wetlands. Another that we know, Ipswich is a coastal community, and so flooding is, an ongoing issue. And 43% of town falls within FEMA's 100-year flood zone. And that also is projected to increase, and that doesn't include, increasing frequency and intensity of rain as well. So that climate change is another thing that we're sort of thinking about and trying to incorporate in the needs assessment and also into the development constraints, because that will affect housing production opportunities in Ipswich. In sort of infrastructural components, one of the things that we heard was, almost all of Ipswich relies on the town's water supply. Almost, I think 98% of the residents use it. But that is also at capacity. And especially with, for increasing frequency of drought events, that is going to need, the town is going to need to expand its capacity in order to meet expanded demand, especially during drought conditions, which will affect and decrease the supply. And the other component of infrastructure was around the municipal sewer. So think half of Ipswich relies on the municipal sewer system, and that's mostly concentrated in downtown, so which limits development opportunities that on other properties that might not rely on sewer. So that's another component that we're looking at in terms of development constraints and opportunities. We also looked at habitat, which if there are other things that you're curious about, I encourage you to look at the handouts for additional pieces and bring questions to the focus groups as well. Okay, next slide. So in terms of, there are also specific requirements that you need to have as part of a housing production plan for the strategy. So it must identify specific zoning amendments that you propose to alter the zoning in order to encourage and accommodate housing production. So one of those, an example of that could be decreasing the minimum lot size to encourage, to sort of better match the existing zoning. So that might be one example. Another requirement for the strategies is that it must identify specific private or municipally owned properties that could be potential sites for developing housing. And that's one of the components to the handouts that we're sending out as well. And we're also going to include that as part of, that's going to be sort of the focus of the focus groups, not to get into that. And then there'll be a slide that will talk about some of the things to expect from the focus groups. So I'm sort of jumping ahead. The third thing is identifying some characteristics of preferred development. So that could include specific areas where you want to include maybe 3 stories or 2 stories. So adding in some components on what you want the development to look like. And so that developers can look at that and use that as a guide when they're putting in proposals for new housing. And then the fourth is it must identify opportunities for participation in regional collaborations. Housing, as we know, as Jen was talking about, is a regional issue, and it really is a problem that can only be solved through regional collaboration. And so that's another component to the strategies that you need to include in an HPP. Okay, next slide. So Jen talked about this at the beginning. You know, the number one benefit of a housing production plan is that it allows you to shape your own future by putting you in the driver's seat. So it looks at what strategies can support greater housing options that will best meet the needs of the community and provide the most benefits, but also what is realistic to implement and how can you do it? And that those last 2 questions are really going to be at the heart of the focus group questions, is thinking about you know, we know what the housing needs are in the community, but how can we address those and what's the best way forward to do that? Next slide. So the second benefit of a housing production plan, as Jen mentioned, is that it gives you an opportunity for control. But just having an approved plan that is approved by the planning board, the select board, and the state's Department of Housing and Community Development, or DHCD, as I think you'll hear us talk about sort of in the acronym. So you might have this approved plan, but you need to demonstrate some action on it. So just having the plan doesn't mean much. You need to demonstrate that you're going to actually put it into action. And part of that is by issuing permits. And so one of the goals that you have to have in a housing production plan is this numerical goal around the number of X number of units that you're going to permit or create each year. And it is a 0.5% and 1% goal to increase the community's total income SHI eligible units or affordable units as a percentage of the community's total housing units. And so in Ipswich, that really translates to in numbers. Like, I don't know what a 0.5% is or what a 1% is, but in Ipswich, the town would need to permit 29 SHI homes, which would be the 0.5% goal, or 57 SHI homes, which is the 1% goal, in a calendar year in order to earn state certification. And that basically means that you've demonstrated action towards meeting your 10% threshold. And so, as I mentioned, you know, an HPP is really a community saying, this is the roadmap that we're going to, we want to meet our 10% threshold as, and this is how we're going to do it. And by taking steps into, you know, accomplishing that, you are entering into this safe harbor period, which allows you to continue to make strides towards meeting that 10% threshold, but on the terms that you've outlined in your housing production plan. And so the state certification, enters this safe harbor, which means that developers can still, can still apply with submit 40p comprehensive permits, but you as a community have the right to deny that comprehensive permit. And that decision will then be upheld by the Housing Appeals Committee. Okay. Next, I was going to say any questions, but there aren't any people to ask any questions. So hopefully there are none, but if you do, again, bring them to the focus groups. Okay, so the call to action, what can you do now? Next slide. So this is going to be talking about, what we're going to do about it and the public process in the housing production plan. So we're asking you to really help answer this question that's at the heart of the effort that Jen started the presentation with, which is, how should you protect your coastal character and historic assets while still creating more housing options? And this planning process is really a chance to get involved, to shape the local policies, and to take more control over the community's future. And the way to do that is through these focus groups. Next slide. So this is the project schedule that we've sort of set, and it's, we had an ambitious project schedule that we started with, and then COVID-19 hit. And so originally what the public process was centered around a public housing forum, which typically has 60 to 70 people in a room, which with COVID is really not possible right now. So the town and we have been working on how can we still have a robust planning process, and we sort of shifted this to Zoom, our new friend in the COVID-19 epidemic. And so you'll see, we've been, working on the needs assessment, and now are ready to take on to this public process with these housing focus groups in May. And then after the focus groups, we'll be using the information that we learned from you and the feedback that you give in the focus groups. Or if you are a resident watching this video and not coming to the focus groups, if you submit your materials to the planning department, incorporating that information. And there will be a slide on that in a little bit. So I'll talk about that and how to participate. And so we'll be using those to develop goals and strategies with those requirements that I talked about that are stipulated as required by an HPP. And then those will be reviewed by our working group of people, of housing advocates in the community that are overseeing the process. And then we'll be drafting the housing production plan with the goal of presenting a housing production plan sometime in late summer. And then it will be revised and submitted to DHCD to be approved. And so after that, this is just the beginning. As I mentioned, there's going to be another, you're going to have to then sort of take the next step and act on it in order to enter that safe harbor. Okay, next slide. So as part of this effort, it's happening concurrently with an update to the community development plan. So you may have seen some information about this last year when we were doing part 1, which was, I think there were 2 public forums, there was an online survey that you could have filled out, and now we're in the second part of this effort that is really focused around creating goals, creating strategies, and eventually creating a draft plan. And so the 2 plans, you want them to be sure that they are in harmony, because the CDP does look at housing as well. And so this effort is also crucial to make sure that these 2 plans are in alignment and are on the same page in terms of the assessing the needs and also looking at the goals and the strategies. And so I'm going to make a quick plug and put on my community development plan hat and ask everyone who's watching this video to also participate in our community survey that we have on right now. And it's on, I'm going to read the little URL on the bottom, but it's at www.surveymonkey.com/r/Ipswich CDP goals. And it's a quick 5-minute survey. It shouldn't take that long. And it's just going to ask you to so throw your hat in the ring on what do you think, which goals do you think should be prioritized in the plan? And we have all of the draft goals for all 4 categories in the CDP. Okay, next slide. So what's the purpose of these focus groups? So we want to be generating, ideas that are feasible to meet Ipswich's housing needs that also preserve and balance preservation of its historic and natural assets. We don't want to be proposing anything that we can't actually implement for whatever reason. And so that's part of why we've asked a variety of stakeholders from different groups to come and participate and weigh in on, to help generate strategies and also weigh in on the feasibility of those that you'll be suggesting. We want to be considering, we'll be looking at the development constraints more in detail, the environmental, regulatory, and infrastructure constraints, and how we might overcome those constraints. And then we want to be using those to identify and evaluate potential housing development sites. We'll have a map and asking you to weigh in on where do you think that are the best sites as you weigh those sites that are impacted by the development constraints of various kinds. And then we also wanted to provide a forum for stakeholders with a variety of interests and expertise to come together. One of the things that we found through doing a lot of these planning processes is that it's really helpful for us to provide an opportunity for people from different interests and perspectives to come together and have an opportunity to talk to one another, so that which may not happen depending on the community, and weigh it and sort of get a sense of where different sides are coming from and what they're advocating for. Okay, next slide. So what to expect during the focus group. So we're going to be back on Zoom as we're recording this video on Zoom too. But we're sticking it to an hour Zoom meeting, and it'll be small group discussions of 7 to 8 people. And there'll be also a mapping exercise. So we'll be using screen sharing. So as part of that, we really ask that you use a computer that has both. Even though you can call in, but
Anna, you froze a little bit. Could you just repeat what you said?
Yeah. So we'll be screen.
Okay, let me take over for her. Hopefully this is still recording properly.
So I know I'm froze again. Uh-oh.
Yeah, let me just finish it because you keep freezing. So what she's trying to say is that it's really important that you have a computer with working video and audio connection. If you think that's going to be an issue for you, I think you should probably connect with Kristen at the planning department, and we can try to strategize what to do about that. Okay, why don't you see it? Should I just keep going, Anna?
It's up to you. I'm getting a slow connection, so.
Okay, let me finish it out. We're almost done here. So what can you do to prepare? Watch the video, which you just did. Maybe you want to rewatch it. I know there's a lot of information here. There are, we're calling it the HPP cheat sheet, and there are also maps that we're providing on the planning department's website. You'll want to look at those. You'll want to review the focus group questions, which are also going to be up there, and really spend some time thinking about. You may even want to write down your answers to those questions in preparation for the focus group, so that you've really already given it some thought and are ready to share with your group what your thoughts are. And then also review the potential development site map, and all those materials will be up on the town website. Okay, and so what if you're watching this video and you're actually not participating in the focus groups? So we would love for you to still contribute. So you've obviously gotten this far, so you've already seen the video. So that's good. The second thing you can do is download the same focus group questions, look at those same materials. They're all up for everyone to view on the website. And you can do answer the questions yourself and do the mapping exercise yourself, and then submit that to the town, to the Ipswich Planning Department. We've provided the address is 25 Green Street if you want to mail it in, or if you just want to scan it and email it, it would be Kristen, KRISTENG, at ipswichma.gov. And we would just ask that you submit those to us by Friday, May 29th. We're trying to keep the schedule moving, and we'd love to incorporate your feedback into the very first draft of the plan. So if you can get us your responses by then we know we can incorporate what you give us. And I think that's everything, other than just saying thank you. And we know that this was a lengthy video, so we're really glad that you stuck with us to the end.